Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. We're going to try something new here, and it might take me a couple of seconds to figure it out because if it starts echoing, that means my Instagram channel is not muted, but we're going to be live on Instagram as well, too. So just figuring things out as they go and happen. That's what makes this kind of stuff fun. But to anyone that's tuning in, please drop your comments in the comment section below. I can't promise you I will see them on LinkedIn because LinkedIn is being LinkedIn and can be buggy sometimes. But if you go to YouTube and subscribe there, you can also comment on YouTube and I should be able to see it. If you're in Instagram, I don't know how that's going to work because it's my first time doing it on Instagram. So yeah, learning new things and doing fun things live on camera. Today I'm super excited because I have a fellow word nerd on with me today, and she gets real technical with the jargon and stuff, and I can't wait to have this conversation. So we have Becca Resnik joining us today. She is owner of Translations by Becca, but she also has an engineering background, which is really important for this conversation. So Becca, hello, happy Friday. Thank you for joining us on Mavens of Manufacturing. How are you doing today?
Yeah, happy Friday, and thanks for having me. I am wonderful today.
I'm so excited to have this conversation because I mean, you love right. And I went on your website and I read your blogs, and I mentioned this before when we went live. I was laughing so hard at your style of writing because you're just like matter of fact and like this is what it is, and there's a bit of sarcasm to your writing too, which I really appreciate. So thank you for joining us. So I really want to give you a chance to just kind of introduce yourself and explain your background a little bit because I think that's important to what you're doing today as a technical translator. So how did you get involved in engineering and manufacturing?
Sure. So I always have to abridge it because it's like this crazy winding path throughout life. But it started in high school when I knew pretty much when I was 14 that I wanted to be a translator. But I was not going to be able to just pay for college. So I thought, I'm going to join the military. I'm going to be a translator for them. This is going to be like all perfect. So I went to my local recruiting station and started taking some exams with them. And then they looked at my exam scores and my school transcripts and they were like, do you like math and science? And I was like, gee golly, I sure do. And they were like, well, have we got the program for you? And so that was how I became a nuke. So Navy nuclear technician. So the contract for that is 6 years. So you're a nuclear technician and another type of technician along with that anytime you're a Navy nuke. So they made me an electrical technician. So my background was working on the electrical systems for the reactors. Well, when I got out of the military, that was in 2013, I basically knew, I loved nuclear. Like nuclear power is so cool. And it's just awesome to learn about and to operate. But I didn't sleep for 6 years while I was in the Navy. And so I was like, I am done with rotating shift work, just pretty much never again. And so I was working with some recruiters to try and find basically what civilian job I could do in the engineering field, because I finished my degree in nuclear engineering technology while I was on active duty. And one of the recruiters found me a job in manufacturing in the textile industry, which is huge, right? Pretty much where I live now. And I thought, okay, manufacturing seems kind of cool. I'd never considered it, but I love anything that has to do with anything industrial, anything tools. I mean, if my dad was working on the car, I wanted to be out there and learn about every tool and everything that he was doing. So I got into manufacturing in just a weird, unexpected way. And then fast forward to about 2018 or so, I thought, I love manufacturing. I love engineering. I love this field, but I've got to get back to language somehow. And so I ended up finding out, I had no idea that technical translation was even a career, that was a profession that existed. So I left the corporate world in 2020, unrelated to any world events going on at the time. It was just coincidence. So left the corporate world, started my business, and that's what I've been doing ever since. And then the medical side came in because I did a lot of research about how to be successful as a freelance translator. And one of the main pieces of advice that I read was you need to have a second domain. So don't just be a legal translator or an economics translator. Have something else to protect yourself. So I went back to school to earn a nursing degree. So I'm actually a licensed RN also, so that I can do the medical side. And so it's awesome because now I can do biomechanical texts. So a lot of like biomechanical patents, for example, and white papers and research. So I get to marry the engineering side and the medical side, which is just awesome. I have the coolest job ever.
Yeah, that's really cool. So we do have comments in the section. Karen, I'm actually drinking coffee out of the cup that you gave me. So thank you for joining us today. She's part of the WIM chapter in Texas. Really fantastic lady. I love her so much. And then we have Drew, the MFG Crow. Thank you, brother, for showing up. I love him so much. So yes, thank you for joining us. And then we have Hank. Good afternoon. Having lunch at my desk with you today. Tell the junior board of directors I said hello, and make sure they watch this episode, Hank, because Becca's just such an amazing individual and she has a lot of experience. And it's funny because I think I told you this last time in our initial conversation. You were telling me all of your experience, and I'm like, did you like graduate super early? Because you look so young to like have this much experience. That's super cool. And then we have Angela. Happy Friday, Megan. Happy Friday, Angela. Thank you for joining us. She's also in Texas. Very fantastic lady. Hopefully she likes this conversation because she does project management. And so translations, I think, kind of tie in with some of the stuff that she does because she deals with a lot of documentation. So one of the things that you taught me, because I always assumed that translators and interpreters were synonymous with each other, but they're not. So can you explain some of the differences there between translations and interpretations? Because there is a difference, and you highlighted those very well in our last conversation. So can you break that down for everyone? I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, no, this is one of the most common questions I get. So interpreters deal with the spoken language. So they convert spoken language from one language to another, and then translators work with the written word. So when I tell people what I do, they generally picture that I am in conferences and board meetings and hospitals and courtrooms. I don't do anything like that at all. Everything that I do is the written word. So patents, websites, operating manuals, user documentation, all those are my bread and butter. And this is really kind of interesting to me because a lot of people don't even realize that translation is a profession. They're like, I didn't even think about all this stuff. And it speaks to the fact that, especially in the United States, we are so spoiled that we get everything into us in perfect English, and we have no earthly idea how much around us is translated. You have to think about the fact that if it's in your hot little hands and it wasn't developed or produced in the United States or another English-speaking country, it was translated. Millions of words were translated to get that product to you. So even stuff that's kind of unexpected. So one of my main clients is a large manufacturer of textile dyes. And so I translate all their procedures and all their spec sheets. And I just sometimes think, I'm like, the dye in my shirt, the dye in my seat cushion, like everything, there's so much around me that this dye could be in that's there because it got translated. A lot of pharmaceuticals, I mean, all that stuff, clinical trials, everything has to be translated to be able to come into the US and reach either the factory that produces it or the end customer. And we have no idea how much around us was translated.
Yeah. Well, and the other interesting thing is too, like, you're not a fluent speaker of German or Japanese, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. So how can you translate something if you're not a fluent speaker in it? Can you explain that? Because I found this really interesting.
Yeah. So there are a couple elements to that, basically. So first of all, another surprise people are always surprised to learn this. Translation is done into your native language, not the other way around. So a lot of people will be like, oh, how many languages do you speak? Or they think that I translate to and from basically any language, or even to and from German and Japanese. Interpretation will pretty much always be both directions because a company is not going to pay two people to be there and do live interpretation. But it's okay because you understand what that person is saying. And if it doesn't sound perfect, it's okay. You're getting the point across. With
Mhm.
translation, you're always going into your native language. And so I don't ever write or communicate into German or Japanese, because when it's written, it has to be perfect, it has to be precise, and it has to sound right. So in interpretation, nobody is ever going to stop and be like, wait a second, you said compared to, and I think you meant compared with, and I don't understand what you said now, because whereas in translation, you'll have that. Or I've had clients who have come back and said, why did you use this type of space here and this type of space here? And that's just not something that happens in interpretation. So it's really that element that you're going into your native language, and just the fact that speaking and writing, really all four language skills. So you have two active skills, which would be writing and speaking, and two passive language skills, so reading and listening. And all four of those come from entirely different parts of the brain. So being skilled in one doesn't mean that you'll be skilled in the other. And if you never practice it, you probably won't be able to do it. And with Japanese, to throw another wrench in the plan, it's a character-based language, meaning that it is not orthographically phonemic, meaning what you see on the paper tells you nothing about how it's pronounced. So I know thousands of characters that I can read on screen and I know what it's saying. I have no idea what the pronunciation is. And there are even many Japanese people who are the other way around. So they
Mhm.
know everything that you're saying when they hear it, but they don't necessarily know what character goes with that.
That's so interesting. So what other like let's talk about then your specific skill set. And before we do that, there have been other comments that come in and I want to give a shout out. So David Turner's here from Kentucky. Hello, David. Thank you for joining us. And then we have Karen again, Navy Nuke. We have many nukes at our company. Such a great group of folks. Learn so much from them. I just think that's like a badass title. What do you do? I'm a Navy Nuke. Like that's intimidating. I think that's cool. And then we have Greg. Wow. Bonjour, Megan and Becca. Great topic for global companies. Yes, especially American companies, because like Becca said, we are very spoiled and we need to not be so much spoiled. And then Hank, I've seen many very interesting interpretations and automation that have been slightly off center. LOL. Yep. And we're going to dive into some of that later on in the conversation, Hank. So let's talk about your specific skill set. Like, what do you bring to the table in terms of being a translator?
Yeah, so having the background in the technical world and having the background in the medical world, because even for just a nursing degree, you do so many hours in the clinical setting, that gives me such an edge because I can follow along with the text and I know what's happening and I know what it's trying to say and I know what it needs to say for an American audience, because it goes so much deeper than just this one-to-one comparison. So there's this big myth out there that circulates sometimes where you'll see where there will be an article that's like, oh, you can just layer the languages on top of each other and things map out. And that's so inaccurate on, I don't know, at least 582 levels. That's just not how language works. So being able to look at the text and know what's going on and having had that background, I mean, if you are a technical translator and you've not put in some years turning wrenches and starting up and shutting down equipment, you're going to write some things that are insane or maybe even unsafe, and you're not going to know it. Or taking, for example, a legal translator. If somebody's a legal translator and they don't have a background as at least, for example, a paralegal, they're going to write some things that are really dangerous and they're not going to have any idea, because you don't know what you don't know. And that's the biggest thing it boils down to. So a great example of this for me would be that if I'm translating an operating manual, there's almost always going to be a safety section. And if there's anything electrical with that equipment, there's always going to be some sentence that says something to the effect of de-energizing or making sure it's free of voltage or whatever it is before you work on that piece of equipment. Well, I have given trainings on the 70E because my background was electrical. And so I know you can't just say voltage free or de-energized or check dead or whatever you want to say. The proper nomenclature is establishment of an electrically safe work condition. Well, guess what? You're never going to find that as a potential translation if you look up that word, whatever that voltage free or de-energized word is in the source language, the language you're translating from. You're just not going to know that. And you're not going to realize that you're writing something unsafe because you don't know what you don't know. And that's kind of, that's true of all of us. You can't know everything, but if you have no background in it, you're not even going to know what to question, even just
Right.
straight.
So I want to get into that. I was looking up your website real quick here because I do want to drop the links into your blogs because they're just entertaining to read. I think they're hilarious because you have that authenticity and you're just like, this is how it should be type attitude. But when it comes to the technical and medical translations, you highlighted some of the most common mistranslations that you come across with some. So one of the things you do get hired for is to fix those errors, right? So I want to talk about the importance of correcting these types of mistranslations. In other words, like, let's get real about what the negative consequences are if we don't correct these mistranslations. So one of your blogs does highlight some of them, but can you name, I think you said there was like 7 or 9 of them. One of them was 7, one of them was 9. So can you go over the most common mistranslations and then talk about in detail, like, okay, if this doesn't get fixed, then this could be the negative consequence of it?
100%. So the quicker topic is probably the consequences. So I'll cover that first. And I like to think of this almost like those safety risk matrices that you see where you're looking at severity of the harm and probability of occurrence. So with mistranslations, you have that full spectrum where there's the severity, and it's almost inversely proportional with the harm that would come from it. So on one end of the spectrum, you have death. And so sometimes people say like, oh, that's so amazing. Like one word that's wrong, somebody could die. And honestly, I mean, even most translators are like, yeah, you're technically right. And I'm glad you're on my side, but that's pretty dramatic. Like that would be extreme for some mistranslation to result in death, but it is possible. And then moving down the scale, you have injury or even illness if there's some kind of maybe a carcinogen in a product that they're working with. So that's still a bit unlikely. I mean, a lot would kind of have to go wrong for somebody to really get hurt, but they definitely could. So if a work instruction is wrong or if something is missing, which is something that I help my clients out with all the time and is another thing that machine translation can't catch. So if I'm looking at a text and I say, hey, you forgot to mention cut resistant gloves and we're working with like a saw blade here and we need to list that. The machine translation is never going to be able to tell the client that. So injury is the next level down. And then taking another step down, you have lawsuits and warranty claims. So now we're getting a little bit more likely. So if you have a mistranslation, perhaps in a contract, a maintenance contract or a warranty contract, or if you have a mistranslation in safety instructions or just how to operate something in general, that manual is going out to a lot of people and that contract is going out to a lot of companies. And that word or that phrase or that sentence is just going to be wrong in all of them. And you're opening yourself up to a lot of legal issues that you just don't even realize are there until the legal issue happens. That's the scary part. And then kind of on the far end of the spectrum, maybe seemingly innocuous, but somewhat likely would be annoyed customers. So all of us have looked at an instruction manual and been like, this is a really crappy translation and I can't make any sense of it. But I'll tell you, I bet not a single one of us has ever called the company and be like, hey, your manual translation is confusing and therefore I will not be continuing to buy your product. Like, no, we don't tell them that. So the company is just continuing on doing what they're doing. And one step further, just not having that customer. So not even having the customer in the first place because they look at your website and it looks like a scam because it's written in really bad English, or they know that they can't trust the product. Or I'll tell you one from experience, just even as an engineer, that if someone is looking at your materials on your website and they're thinking about buying your product, but it's a really bad translation, that's an immediate red flag because, for example, if they run a production line, they know that they're probably not going to get support. So that was something we used to think about is like, okay, immediately you can tell this company is not based in the United States and they obviously don't have people who are native English speakers. Are we going to be able to get any kind of support when we need help? Probably not. I'm not even going to buy this product. So that's kind of the spectrum there. and then
Gotcha.
into the types of errors. So I think it was 9 on the SME translator, so subject matter expert translator. So I kind of break that out down into 9 types of errors that people make if they don't have a background in what they translate, which I like to call this the big secret of the translation industry. Very few translators have any background in what they translate. That should sound terrifying. I always think, like, when there's a product recall on, for example, some medical implant, I'm like, how many of those happened because of a mistranslation? Because this person just had no idea what they were looking at. And then the article was about machine translation and the errors that it makes. And I break down 7 errors there. So which one should we dive into first?
I dropped the links into the comment section for both of those. And then just real quick, I want to add your website here. So if you want to look at those articles, she also has some other articles, and one of them was titled Why to Hire a Freelancer. So hopefully we can dive in that later. I just saw that one and I'm going to read that later on, but we can talk about that if we have time. But please go visit her website, because she does have a lot of, and she shows examples on these blogs that we're going to talk into later. So if you want to follow along, that's the website to go to. And then real quick, we had a couple more comments that I just want to go. Miriam, thank you for joining us. Excited that you're here. And then Angela, nearly everything in the supply chain requires some sort of documentation, specification, manuals, requirements. What an amazing skill. So Angela, connect with Becca if you need help with some of the translation between different languages, well, Japanese, German, and English, because that's her specialty. But yeah, let's get into the subject matter expert one. And this is something that I mentioned in my post earlier today. Jordan Yates, she has a Failing for You podcast, and she had Adam Kimmel on, and he's a technical writer. So he's not a translator, but he's a technical writer. But he was talking about the importance of having some experience in the industry that you're writing for, because there is that jargon that we need to know. We have to understand like what the shop floor talk is, because it's not the same if you're outside of the industry. So something that could be very well known among us, someone who's outside of the industry is not going to know that. So if you're trying to be a technical writer, but you have no experience in the industry that you're writing for, it can get really confusing. But there are also differences in meanings among different cultures as well, too, which I think is something that is important you should touch on. So let's go into the subject matter expert one first and break down those nine mistranslations.
Sure. So just to kind of pick out some of them. So I've kind of titled all of them within that article. So I have like So Totally Clueless, where they obviously have no idea. A friend of mine was like, you need to have like the whatever the blonde lady is from Clueless, like a picture of her or something, but they just have no idea what they were looking at. And sometimes they don't realize they had no idea what they were looking at. I'll give an example of that one in a moment. But another set of errors I see all the time is over or under engineering, where they don't know that a certain term exists or doesn't exist, or they find, they're looking up and researching on maybe Wikipedia and YouTube, and they find what seems like a fancy term. And so they're like, I guess that's it. And then you read it and you're like, man, this sounds batty. Like this is not, that's not a term that's ever used. There was one, this is a smaller example, but one that from a translation I was working on this morning, where instead of thermal everywhere, it was for a heat exchanger. So like thermal product and thermal carrier, like they wrote thermic everywhere. And I looked it up, and it does look like maybe that's used in like the research setting, but I've never ever heard anyone say that. Like we don't say thermic. And so I see that all the time, where they find this fancy term and they're like, that must be it. No. So a lot of errors like that, or even just style. So there was one where the person had written, and this was for machining centers, and they were like, the diminutive space requirements will be embraced by your shop floor. It's like, no, you've obviously never, like, I have worked with people who run machining centers. That was like on the other side of the room from me when I was in engineering. Like, that's not how these people talk, and you're not going to convince them to buy your machining center that way. That sounds really ridiculous. Like,
it sounds like they're auditioning for a telenovela or soap opera or something.
Yes.
Like, no one talks like that.
Yes, 100%. So the biggest issue that I see is not being able to follow along with the text and know what to question. So this is the other big thing too, is not knowing to question terminology and not knowing to question meaning. So there was one from I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and this was for basically high pressure nozzles. And the type of translation software that we use, I can see how people have translated a certain sentence or word in previous manuals. And this one, I was actually laughing at my computer because there were like 6 different ways that all the previous translators had guessed what this sentence was saying, and they all got it wrong. And I can see who they are. So I'm like, no, I verified that they have zero technical background. And that all their translations were, it was crazy. It was like, the nozzle is turning counterclockwise during operation. And so the threads are in rotation the other direction. Like there were like 6 different variations of this. It was just trying to say that the connection is reverse threaded. So just because of the fact that in the source language, they didn't have the term for that, and it just doesn't match one-to-one. They had to use this really complicated phrase. And so in my translation, I was like, well, the connection is reverse threaded. Like that's what they were trying to say. But these translators didn't know what to do with that, and they didn't even realize that it was nonsense what they were writing. So that's really what it boils down to. Or even another one of my great examples, I know we talked about this during the pre-brief, was from a manual for a controller, and it had a section all about the controller addresses and all these addresses. So this was a text that was in German, and in German, the decimal and the comma separator are swapped. So they use a comma where we use a decimal and vice versa in their numbers. So all these addresses were like 147,3. Well, the translator looked at that and was like, oh, I am a smarty pants, and I know that you need to swap the decimal and comma separator. And this is what machine translation does too, by the way. And I was like, oh boy, pretty sure this is not right. So I contacted the client just to make sure, like, hey, you don't have like the US program and the, the European program, right? Like we can't change those. And they were like, oh no, please change all those back. Like they're not 2 separate programs. So if that happens, your controller just doesn't work. And then people aren't going to know that. People aren't going to look at the manual and be like, I wonder if the translator thought they were being clever and swapped the comma and the decimal. Like, no, your controller is just not going to work. And that's a great example to me of the fact that everything is not, I like to say, look upable. There's this big myth that like, oh, you can just like read a bunch of Wikipedia articles and then you are super mega expert. No, that's not how it works.
But isn't there an easy solution for that? If you're not a subject matter expert within the area that you're translating for, why not just pick up the phone or email the actual subject matter expert and just maybe clarify or verify that what you're trying to translate it into is the correct information? Couldn't they just do that? And if so, like, why aren't they doing that? Because that's what I do. If I don't understand something, because it's a new area for me, I'm going to call up the engineer or the owner of the company and be like, what does this mean? Because it's not making sense to me. And I don't think it's going to make sense to anyone else. Because like we love our acronyms, right? Like we love giving things abbreviations, and we love naming something 5 different things sometimes. Like for an example is systems integrator. I don't know how many times I've heard system integrator name something different. And I'm like, what? Wait, what? Like, what is this? So I just call and I ask questions, and then I have them look at the draft and proof it. Can't they do the same?
So technically, yes. And I think the most accurate answer is they don't know to ask that, because there's this big myth that's like, yeah, you just like read some books and watch some YouTube videos and then you're the master. And I'll tell you, it seems like it's worse in technical translation specifically. So I think when people see legal terms or economics terms, they're like, whoa, stock market, that's scary. Like, I don't know anything about that. Or like legal, there could be real consequences. People are scared of that naturally. Whereas with technical translation, what I see in the translation field is that people just think like, if you know the right end of the screwdriver to hold on to, you know all the things. And that's what I think it boils down to, is people think that it's like, if you can follow along and see that like part A is being bolted to part B, then obviously you're getting it all right. And they just, it really boils down to that concept that they don't know what they don't know. And they all think just like, yeah, this is perfect and I got it completely right. And this, to me, you see this a lot. It's like, well, okay, sure, I acknowledge that maybe because I haven't been in the industry, I don't get everything right. Maybe there might be some weird terms, there's some weird phrases, but I probably got it right. And this is batty to me. It's like, wait. So the statement is, I've never been there to know otherwise, but I think I'm probably right. Like, I don't,
Yeah.
it's like some weird circular, I have no idea. So, whereas on the other side, you have people like me who are like, no, you're getting things that are not right. I know exactly why you wrote those things because I see how you would think that, but it's not right.
Yeah.
Even
You have to. Yeah, you have to reach out and confirm that information because and there's negative consequences that can cause injury, cause costs, more costs than they want to, or cause your life. Like, and I don't mean to like laugh about it, but it's just like we're working with like really big machines sometimes that have dangerous parts on it and heavy parts on it, and you want to make sure that all that information is translated correctly because if not, like it's just batty to me, like you said.
yes.
Are there anything else that you want to cover with that one article on the subject matter experts? Like, is there something that we missed there? Because I do want to get into a little bit with the machine translation conversation.
Well, the only other thing to tack on there, and I would encourage people, just please do check out that article. It's always, people are so, it's so eye opening for people. I always get the feedback that, like, A, it was hilarious, and B, I learned so much that I just had no idea about. Because again, we don't know about translation. You don't know what you don't know. But the only other thing to tack on is, again, about that concept of why these errors happen and nobody knows. So there's this kind of set of characteristics with translation that I think is unique to translation, or at least I've never come up with another profession that's like it and no one else has, which is it is high stakes. There are wrong answers and the client can't determine whether it's right or wrong. By nature of hiring a translator, you don't know what that text says and you just have to trust that it's right. So I think that's the biggest difference too, is like, that person looks at the translation and they think, okay, I guess that's right. And they don't know necessarily the things that are wrong. And so that's why all these translations just kind of propagate. The obvious ones, it's like, ooh, this doesn't quite make sense, or we don't say it that way. But some of the mistranslations from both the non-SME side and the machine translation side, they just get through for that exact reason, is the client can't evaluate it. Only another translator can evaluate it. It's not like a robot where you can say, you can calculate OEE, you can look at your dimensions in the space, you can do safety risk assessments. The client can determine if that solution worked for them.
Yeah.
Or on the other end of the spectrum, like artwork, like you can determine if that worked for you. Only the translator knows if that translation was right.
That's a great point to put, because that's why most clients are hiring you, because they don't know. Like,
Bingo.
I don't know how to do this. So I think that's a great point to highlight. And then Karen just made a couple comments. Technical translations require precision, attention to detail. Accuracy is paramount, as even minor errors can have significant consequences in technical documents. It is scary when you think about what could go wrong if it is not correct, i.e. industrial boilers and pressure vessels. So it deserves way more respect than they get. That's a great point. And then trust that it is right makes me nervous. But I mean, that's like, if you aren't a translator and you hire someone who might have the credentials from other people and the references, right? Because we go off of references, and then someone recommended them, but then they don't have the subject matter experts. That client's not going to know until something does go wrong. So before we get into machine translation, how do clients find out about you? Like, is it because something did go wrong or didn't add up, so then they find you? Or are they going on LinkedIn and then they see your content and then they kind of have that doubt in the back of their mind, like, ooh, I wonder if this translation was correct. Let's reach out to her. And it's like, how do you get your clients?
So LinkedIn and my website are the main two
Mhm.
places that clients find me. And it usually is just because either their previous translator left the field or they're launching a new product line, or a lot of times it's because they're just getting started marketing to the US. So maybe they
Gotcha.
never marketed outside of their country, or they only marketed to the UK and they're like, now we need everything in US English. So I have gained clients who are like, yep, we had already had things translated. Now we got to start translating into US English, or even, maybe they marketed to Australia or Canada or some other variant of English. So sometimes that's how they find me. And every once in a while, I do receive the comment that, like, yeah, there were some issues with terminology that we kind of questioned, but we weren't really sure. Again, you're just in that scenario. It's like, well, okay, I guess this is right. And a lot of people just don't know that translators can be in the field for years and decades and just be delivering, honestly, crap, and just nobody knows. And that's why it's so challenging. It's like people think, oh, he or she's been translating for 26 years, obviously they're good. Oh, no, obviously they're not good. I see this all the time, that it's like, no, they just either went from client to client, or all their clients were just ignorant and they had no idea. And I've had many where I've had to just work with them and say, I'm sorry, but all your old stuff is just wrong, and we need to work together to figure out how to get that right before I can even start on new translations, because there's just so much just
Yeah.
nonsense and lack of safety.
Well, and you brought up another interesting point. Like, you're saying US English for a specific reason, because it is a different dialect from English spoken in the UK, for example, or in Australia. And there are those slight dialect differences. And we might say something, but it's going to mean something completely different in the UK. Like, it's not going to mean the same. And like, yes, I've met like, we make jokes about it each other, right? Because I think you said something about, oh, the proper English. We are not considered the proper English. Like, the UK will make fun of us for how we say certain things, which is hilarious when you're hanging out with them. And they're true, like, they're absolutely right. But I think that's an important point to recognize too. Like, our English is not the same that you're going to get in other parts of the world. So we got to keep that in mind too. I do want to talk about machine translation, because you brought this up, and I've had people ask me the same question. Are you concerned about AI or chat GPT or whatever taking away your job? And I'm like, no, not at all. And I'm not, because yes, it's a great tool. It can be a great tool when you're trying to get certain information. So like for me, I've used it before to create outlines for some of the blogs that I'm writing, or if I have a question about something and don't know where to start my research, I'll pop that question in chat GPT, and then it will bring up, prompts for that. And then I'll do my research based off of that. But I know, like, sometimes when how people will post something, I know if it's AI generated or not, because it doesn't have that human touch to it. And I can just tell because it's really, really dry. When it comes to translation, though, there are certain things that it can't do, or it misses the mark on it. So can you dive into some of those things? Because this is a really interesting conversation, and I think people need to hear where the shortcomings are of this technology. Not saying that we're not going to get there one day. Right now, we're not there. So what are some of the most common errors that you see in machine translation?
Yes, I love this topic. And just to clarify for the audience, because virtually, probably none of them have read the article, machine translation is what we call in the field like Google Translate and DeepL and stuff like that. So if you hear me say MT or machine translation, think Google Translate. That's what we call those programs. So I actually realized the other day, I need to go back and update that article about machine translation errors. It's called "The Robots Are Coming, But Not for Me," because that's
Which is hilarious, by the way.
Thank you. I was really proud of that. So that's the one with the 7 error categories. I need to add one because I wrote that shortly before OpenAI came into existence. So now there's an even bigger one that I need to add to the list, which is hallucinations. So this is why machine translation is so dangerous, because it hallucinates and you will never know, because it hallucinates and lies very convincingly. And what I'm seeing a lot of nowadays, I mean, even on LinkedIn, people are like, oh yeah, we just boop, 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 run it into Google Translate. And then we have some people like clean up the grammar. It's like, these things are inaccurate and you don't realize it. So LLMs, large language models, are trained to look for the next close approximate word if it doesn't have that exact word somewhere within it. And this is going to happen all the time because there are always new technologies. There are always new ways of saying things. Sometimes people will say like, oh, well, you know, it's just going to get better because more and more stuff will be uploaded and then it'll have everything. Okay, that's like saying, guys, we wrote all music. All songs are sung. Put away your guitars. We wrote all the music. We did it. Like, that's not true at all. Like, stop saying that. Like, no, everything is not going to be written. Language and the landscape of the world and technology and everything is constantly evolving. It's never going to be all there. So when it's looking for equivalents to these words, if something is missing, either because the word is new or typos, that's where I see a lot where the machine translation will just make stuff up. You're going to not know that that is wrong. I can give you a great example from just a few weeks ago. I was doing a biomechanical patent. This was for a mechanical heart valve. So the sentence said something to the effect of the heart valve, making it to where you could tighten up the sutures so that the valve would stay closed and not have insufficiency. So when pressure in the downstream chamber of your heart, because your heart is just a pump, when pressure in the downstream chamber increases, that pushes the valve back. And if your valve is insufficient, meaning that the leaflets don't close properly, it'll shoot blood into the upstream chamber. And obviously you don't want that. Your heart is going to be very efficient. So that's actually a kind of a common heart defect. So regurgitation is another word for it. So it's regurgitating the blood back into the atrium. So it was saying you could tighten the valve sutures to prevent the insufficiency. That sentence sounded really convincing, right? I mean, and I'll tell you, as somebody with a nursing degree, like with a medical background, that sounded perfectly fine. And even if you kind of looked at the words a little bit, like, okay, everything seemed okay. But the issue was the engineer who wrote this had kind of made up a word. And if you really dug into it and understood what was happening with that patent, it was not talking about sutures. It was talking about tightening up the chordae tendineae. These are your literal heartstrings. So these are the strings that are holding your valve closed. It was saying that you can retension those tendons in order to maintain sufficiency of the valve. You would never know that ever if you weren't able to dig into the patent. I mean, everything about that sounded very convincing. And in that case, you're either not going to get your patent or you're going to lose your patent because it's not going to hold true to what the invention is. But the scary thing there is you would just never know it. And I see this all the time. So sometimes it's kind of obvious. There was a typo one time. This still cracks me up. It was for an annual report for this company. It was an annual report and a sustainability report. And there was a typo so that instead of saying the finance industry, it said the finance wasteland, which I think is really hilarious. But at least in that case, like you can tell, okay, obviously it is wrong. Like we're not talking about the finance wasteland. Like it's really but all those little sneaky ones, you'll never know. And I see this every single time that I see machine translation. And here again, you're having these people who are like, yeah, we just clean up the grammar and it's fine. And that's the big issue with it is these, and this is what I need everybody in the world to understand. These programs are programmed to give you a grammatically correct result. And that's why people think that machine translation is perfect now, is because even 5-10 years ago, you would plug something into an MT program and it would spit out like true nonsense. And you'd be like, ha, 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 that's hilarious. And it's obviously wrong because it's not even a sensible sentence. Whereas now it is grammatically correct. Like the program knows for the most part not to give you something that's grammatically incorrect. You just don't know that the meaning is wrong. So hallucinations would be the biggest one. Another example I love giving people is localization. And to be honest, this hits more often than I even expected getting into the technical translation side. Like you would think localization. So this is, to kind of define the term, localization is when a product or a service or a text needs to be made specific to the geographic locale of the target audience. So for me, that's a US American audience. So with localization, I want to preface this example by saying I truly do not want to get political at all, but this example is like too perfect not to talk about. This was the corporate policy for this company, and it was all about they had a lot about like ESG, so environmental, social, and governance, and about code of conduct and everything. And there was a sentence in there that says, we support a liberal government. And I don't care what you believe in, you cannot put that in a corporate policy in the United States. Like you cannot. And so I had to go back to the client, and we kind of worked out an alternative to put there, but you can't do that, especially because it was a manufacturing company. And you picture in manufacturing areas, a lot of these are not they're not areas that are going to really take kindly to a sentence like that. And so you, again, if you trust that to machine translation and you don't have the work done by somebody who really knows what they're looking at and knows about translation and can evaluate that and knows the culture, you're going to find yourself in trouble. I mean, I can't even imagine what that would have been like for that. And I have there's another example on in the blog about even just stuff that is racist that they don't realize. Like you don't realize what is offensive in that target culture.
Right. I've heard that a lot with some of the terms here that you should not be saying at all, and then going to other countries, and because they're listening to our pop culture music and those terms are being dropped all the time, and they don't understand like why it's okay for certain groups to say those words, and then they're saying it and they're not part of those groups. It's like you can't do that. You can't. Well, why? You're saying it all the time. Nope, you can't say that, as you can't do it. So it's really interesting to have those types of conversations. And like I have a lot of friends from different countries, and the way that we like talk, it takes them a minute. Like they'll take it literally, and they're just like, wait, what do you mean by that? Like, that sounds horrible. And it's like, oh no, it's kind of like slang. Like that's total slang. So yeah, you have to be careful of how you're saying things to people who are not part of your culture, because it can be taken differently. We are getting a ton of comments. Karen said, you can have 25 plus years of experience in doing something wrong. Longevity is important, but so is quality. Absolutely. AI starts the process. Humans refine and finish the process. And she laughed at that. And then Hank, I worked in a Japanese plant where all the auto off hand switches were auto stop hand job. Whoa. We changed a lot of labels on the machine. That's hilarious.
That is so funny.
I wouldn't be able to go to work and not laugh. I don't know how you kept a straight face, Hank. Is it we no longer fully understand the power of words? Finance wasteland is one thing. Sutures versus tendons for a heart device patent is something else. Wow. Just the way you're describing that, I couldn't be in the medical field. I would get so sick to my stomach. My daughter's going into school for nursing, and some of the stuff she was explaining to me, I'm like, can we not talk about this? Like, I just ate and I don't want to throw up all over the place. With MT, follow Ronald Reagan's wise words. Trust but verify. Yeah. So then what else about machine translation? I think one that was really interesting is like the acronyms. Like before, we have so many, and some of them are the same. So like, how can it decipher which one we're actually meaning if we just put that in there and we're not saying specifically what it is, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
So what else about machine translation outside of localization and hallucination? What's another one?
Let's see. So one of my favorites really is just source text errors. And this is one that I touched on it a little bit with talking about SMEs, but it's even bigger with machine translation because now you really have no one who's following along with that. So all these errors, like I said, the typos are an issue, and maybe a missing safety instruction, but even just stuff that just doesn't quite make sense. There again, looking at just the way we say things, but even being able to follow along with the procedure. So I don't think I have, I mean, I hate to use a superlative, but I would say I have not ever worked on an instruction manual that didn't have at least one error in the source text. And that's one of the biggest points of value that I give to my clients is, okay, you're talking about this heat exchanger and you were saying to remove the tube bundle before you can clean it, but you can remove the tube bundle in this model where it's bolted in, but this manual is the one for your welded tube bundle where you can't remove it.
Yeah.
So machine translation is not going to pick that out. So that is by far one of the main places where my clients are like, oh man, like you picked that out. And machine translation is just not going to know that. And there again, your customers are just not going to trust your product, and or they're going to be very confused. But all those errors that it can't pick out. Any kind of, another good one would be, and this one's a little bit close to the idea of like localization and culture and everything, but just connotation. So there was another sustainability report that I was doing that was for a really high-end manufacturer in the sanitation industry. I mean, they have shower heads that are like $7,000, which is just inconceivable to me. Like they're
What?
like gold. Yeah, I know, it was insane. So everything about their reports and their technical manuals is, even their technical manuals is very like, it's very posh and very like hoity-toity is my favorite term for it. And they have a design that they're trying to work on where the toilet can incinerate the waste, but the machine translation was like, it's gonna burn the feces. And like, okay, fine, feces is like, that's technically the right word, but that's so horrifying when you're like reading about like, oh, I want this gold-plated shower head and it's gonna burn my feces. Like excrement, waste, like there are so many better ways to say that. And I see this all the time. Actually, in that same text, they were talking about a like a green sustainability initiative. And they gave this one guy a nickname for like, I translated as him being like the master of greenery or something to that effect. But the translation, the machine translation was like Lord of Buildings, which is really intense. And also another one that can be really offensive in some areas in the United States. So it's like,
Right.
no, it's not Lord of Buildings. So you see that all the time. Or there was another one, it was actually kind of interesting. They had a campaign for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they had a phrase that it's almost hard to explain just because it doesn't translate at all directly. But the way they had physically written it, it was like two phrases in one. And it does not translate at all. And so the machine translation it translated it as just respect me, which wasn't completely off, but that's not what it was really saying. So my translation for this, which really captured the sort of 2-for-1 that it was mashing together, was do I give and get respect? And that I made that their US slogan for what they were trying to do. So it wasn't quite as cool and pithy and concise as the original version, but you just lost all of that. Was just like, respect me. Like that's not
which could come across as really rude to some of the American audience.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
if you put that out there, everybody, and I mean this, like there's certain people in the world that would just be like, no,
Yes.
like F you, I'm not respecting you. Like they would
Yeah.
just be very blunt back. So I think the way that you translate it softened it a little bit. So yeah, that's funny. We did get a couple more comments. We already said that. Oh, we already pulled that one up. Karen with MT. Oh, we pulled that one up. Hold on. I need more coffee. I'm just going to blame it on that. My old German roommate would always say, "Can you do me a pleasure?" No. Absolutely not. I'm not that. I knew what she meant. Can you do me a favor? I never corrected her until she used that term with our handsome professor. Talk about an awkward moment. Yeah, like, no thanks, not doing that. Well, I do want to talk about like some of the things that you do to kind of keep up pace with some of these changes that happen, and like what sort of tools are you using as a translator? Because I think that's important as well too. Like as a translator with things changing in language, how do you keep up to date with that? And then what are some of your favorite tools to kind of aid you in the translation process?
Well, as far as keeping up with what's going on, trade shows, newsletters, LinkedIn, I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road for me and for my clients, because I always know the latest things that are happening. And there again, how people are saying things, how are they talking about the technologies that are out there, and knowing what's out there. Because again, if you don't know that there is a such thing, there's a washer, and then there are other types of washers that are similar to that. You'll just always be like, oh, dishwasher, because you don't know what else is out there. So knowing what's out there is a huge part of what I do. And then as far as tools, so the main type of tool that we work in as translators is called a CAT tool. This is a computer-aided translation tool. And I can't stress enough, because this confuses people, this has nothing to do with MT. It is not an automatic translation. It's not anything like that. It is basically like a souped up version of a word processor. And so it can pull in glossaries for my specific clients. So if you look at, for example, like BMW and VW, those two companies do not want their stuff sounding like the other. So they have very specific phrases and terms that they want you to use. So sort of a glossary. And then the other part of that is a translation. So that's called a term base. The other part of a CAT tool is a TM, or a translation memory. And this is huge for consistency. So this is what I was talking about earlier, where I can see how other translators have translated something. And that where this becomes really key, especially in instruction manuals, is matching phrases and especially titles of documents. So you can't have a manual that's like, for this step, make sure that you read the instruction manual for installing the motor in the ZX130 model. And then in the next sentence, you say, read the manual for installation of the ZX130 motor. Like that, yeah, okay, you said the same things. No one's ever going to be able to find those documents. They have to be the same. And if you've got a company that has a lot of longevity, you're going to have a lot of those phrases that have repeated over the years, and you have to have consistency. So with CAT tools, I can see that background. I'm constantly building my own private database of what their texts say. So CAT tools would be the biggest thing that are a benefit for a technical, medical, anybody who's really outside the literary domain of translation.
Okay. Do you use any of like the language apps to keep up to date with the language, or is that just completely different because of the side of the brain that it uses?
So I do try and keep in touch a little bit with kind of what's going on out there. Sometimes I'll read the news in German or Japanese or something, but for the most part, it just doesn't affect the type of translation I do, just because I don't do the cultural stuff, which is another reason I don't interpret. I don't even know what the kids are saying these days in English, let alone another language. Like I sometimes when the next generation talks, I'm like, I don't know what you're saying. And good for them.
Yeah.
Like that's a rite of passage that they get to have this language that they understand, and the grown-ups don't. Like that's what's supposed to happen with language. So I don't do a ton of that, just because it's so outside of what I do, with the rare exception of maybe like a marketing text. But even then, I can usually either figure it out or just talk to the client. Like this is some crazy word. Like there's a phrase, it's been around for a long, long time, but I just discovered it. So in German, to say something is like really cool or really special or something, they say, that's the hammer. And so if you just hear that in English, you're like, that's not a hammer. What are you talking about? But they use that for like, that's awesome. That's like the cool new thing or something.
That's funny. Immediately my nerdy mind goes to Thor, because I'm like an Avengers nerd. So like I'm like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, my daughter's part of Gen Z, and sometimes I overhear conversations with her friends, and I'm just like, I can't be around you anymore. Like I don't know what you're talking about. Well, Becca, this has been really interesting. We have a couple minutes left, so I want to give you a chance to ask the audience something. So if you had a big ask for everyone tuning in, what would your big ask be for them?
Well, before I even give the ask, I really sincerely want to thank the audience for being here. You don't know how much it means to me, and I hope you learned something. I know most people are like, words, that's dumb and boring. I don't want to hear about words. And it's like, communication.
Not me. I'm like, yay.
Yeah. You would be one of the few people who are like, yes, like, like I don't get invited to a lot of parties. So there's a reason, like, I just want to talk about words. So the thank you would be the first thing. But the big ask would be just spread the word. I mean, people just have no idea about this. And I'll tell you, the media is, I've been really safe in my business. Like business is hot right now. I am so overloaded with work, but I really am, I'm counting my blessings on that, because translators are leaving the profession in droves right now because the media has portrayed machine translation as like, guys, we won language, we won it all, we got it all. And so clients, there again with that concept that you're not equipped to evaluate that translation and it looks grammatically, so all these people are like, yeah, we're just going to trust machine translation and it's perfect. And I'm telling you, mark my words, I don't know if this is going to happen in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, but you will start seeing things about how there aren't any translators left because everybody had to leave the field because all these big companies were like, oh, yeah, it's fine. That's just what we're going to do. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Yay.
I got booted out. So continue with what you're saying. Sorry about that to everyone tuning in.
So where did I leave off when it cut off?
Just start over. What's your big ask for everyone?
Sure.
You were starting with your thank you, and then that happened. So I apologize, but that's what happens with technology.
Yeah. So after the thank you of just thank you all for being here, because I know so many people are just like words are just stupid and boring, and it's like communication, like the thing that happens after like natural body functions is like we communicate. That's stupid anyway. So after that, I would give the big ask of just spread the word. Just the media is really ruining what the public thinks of with language and with machine translation. So I always talk about how my business is doing great. Like business is hot. My clients still really trust me, but I always think like, you know, it really could go away at any time. And translators, I'm seeing this a lot. Translators are leaving the field in droves because the media is like, we won language. We won language, everybody. We did it and we've conquered it. And machine translation is perfect because there again, all of that output is now grammatically correct and it's very convincing. And if the media says it's all correct, well, again, the client doesn't have any way of verifying that. So the client goes, yeah, okay, I guess machine translation is good enough. So it's kind of getting to be, it's getting strange, I guess. And mark my words, I don't know if this is going to happen in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. I promise you are going to see stuff in the news about how where are all the translators? Where did they go? Like people are not entering this profession. People are hacking their their translators because they just think machine translation is perfect. So there again, I'm like, man, things have been really great for me and my clients still see my value. But what happens when people continue to be convinced? Because it's just so different from any other profession.
I always try to recommend to people to not fully listen to the news media because I think there is some bias there. And it's the same with like automation and robotics where they're creating this narrative that automation and robotics are taking away jobs. And that's just not True. So do your research. Definitely reach out to Becca. Becca, if anybody has questions for you, what's the best way to get a hold of you and connect with you?
Probably the best way would be LinkedIn. So Becca Resnik. I realize I didn't put my last name in the
Totally
part
fine.
under there, but so my LinkedIn is a great way to get in touch with me, and I'm always trying to grow my network. I'm a big believer in networking, so everybody please connect with me. And my website would be the other place. So go to translationsbybecca.com, and hopefully you enjoy the blogs, and just, let me know if you have questions about language, or if you see people who are unsure about it and trusting machine translation, I'd be happy to have the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I want to I need coffee today, man. I want to thank everyone who stuck on during those technical difficulties. I do apologize for that. Sometimes connections just disconnect. So this will be on YouTube on demand. So feel free to go to Mavens of Manufacturing YouTube channel and subscribe there. You can catch the playback and get the rest of this episode. And then, yes, reach out to Becca. I hope you all have a wonderful and safe weekend. And we will have another episode of Mavens of Manufacturing next week on Friday. So have a good one, everyone. Thanks, Becca. This episode of Mavens of Manufacturing has been sponsored by Z Ink Solutions. Z Ink Solutions. This isn't your grandmother's copywriting service. We provide copywriting and copy editing services that provide impactful text and memorable storytelling for a variety of brands and industries. Contact us today at zinkSolutions.com. That's z-inksolutions.com.